Last time we were talking about the city of the Omride dynasty and some difficulty that the Omrides began to have with the entity of Damascus. And you suggested that there was some sort of disturbance here at Megiddo around 840 or so, maybe a partial destruction. Let's pick up with that and take us into the next period, the Iron IIB.
Sure. So I think that we can notice in the material culture some sort of evidence for a gap of occupation at Megiddo after around 840. Again, remember that we are still well radiocarbon dated there.
Right.
So there is several decades of abandonment, I suppose, or a very low-level activity. And how do we do this? We do this by comparing what we see here at Megiddo to sites around us, such as Hatzor, farther in the north. And then there is this recovery at Megiddo, and it's already the material culture which goes with the recovery is already that of the Iron IIB, what we describe as the Iron IIB. The transition from the Iron IIA to the Iron IIB, according to our radiocarbon studies, should be located somewhere around 800 BC, perhaps 10 years later, 1520. Of course, the transition is always gradual because we are speaking about pottery traditions, so we need to keep this in mind. And then there's this recovery, and we get really the second big prosperity of the Northern Kingdom as represented here at Megiddo. And basically, we are speaking at the later phase of the Northern Kingdom, so I suppose looking at the geopolitical situation in the region, that we start with Joash of the Nimshite dynasty. The Nimshites started with Jehu, but in the beginning they were completely under the power of Damascus. Joash was the first one who managed to fight back and win a battle against Damascus and recover the power of the Northern Kingdom also in the lowlands, because the Northern Kingdom survived in the highlands around Samaria. But now they take over again their lands in the lowlands, including the Jezreel Valley. So this is Joash, and this happens around 800 BC. And the kings that we need to pay attention to are Joash and his son Jeroboam II, our beloved king. The two of us, were dealing with this king both here and at Kiryat Yearim near Jerusalem. Right. Several years ago. So Jeroboam II, he was first of all he is the king who ruled for more than 4 decades. So we are speaking grosso modo about I'm not giving the exact dates here, grosso modo 780 to 740 BC, a little bit more than 40 years. And we know from different pieces of evidence that he was a powerful king. He managed to expand. We have this even in the prophetic works in the Bible. He expanded in the northeast, in the north, and he really established a mini empire. Now Israel has the upper hand when we compare it to Damascus. So there is half a century of a very strong power of the Northern Kingdom, more than half a century, perhaps 60 years of very strong dominance of the Northern Kingdom until it starts crumbling for different reasons, but especially under the power of Assyria, the change of power in Assyria and different policy of conquering these lands in the west. So Jeroboam II. So we are speaking, when we speak about the Iron IIB at Megiddo, we refer mainly to a layer which had been, big parts of it had been uncovered by the University of Chicago in the 20s, in fact. And then also we deal with this layer in several places at the site.
This is a very special city in this particular period. It's given over to a completely new plan with some very particular buildings that sort of dominate 1/3 of the layout of the city. Can you tell us about those buildings?
We are sitting in one of them.
Ah, okay.
So we are sitting in one of them. This is a city with 17 buildings of this type, 17 structures, and they are big. I mean, they are like 30 meters long and maybe more than 10 meters broad. And they are very specific. Each of these buildings has 3 aisles. The central aisle is paved with plaster, and the 2 side aisles with stones, paving. And then in between there are rows of pillars, stone pillars, and troughs. This is one of the troughs. This is another trough over here. And because of this very special structure, they were described immediately, when they were found, as stables. And the University of Chicago, in the beginning, one of the excavators, PLO guy, came up with this idea that these are the stables of Solomon. Now, why is Solomon? There is no indication in the Bible that Solomon built stables at Megiddo. However, there is indication in the Bible that Solomon built Megiddo in 1 King 9:15. And then in the book of Kings, in those chapters which speak about him as a great ruler, the stories of construction and trade and wisdom and all this, several times horses and chariots and stalls pop up. So Solomon is the king of the stables and horses in these chapters in the beginning of the book of Kings. And at that time, in the 1920s, a little bit naive in the way that we are looking, some of us, at the Bible, they came up with this idea that here are the Solomonic stables of Megiddo. The problem was that a bit later, these buildings became, some sort of a center of dispute on two accounts. The first one is the date, how to date them, and the second one, the function. Are they really stables?
Right. Let's talk about the date first. So the original excavators called them Solomonic. A little bit later, they called the next layer down Solomonic. And then, of course, our team comes here and does some renewed work here. How do we date these stables, and on the basis of what? How do we tie this into our chronology?
So today the situation is quite clear because we know well the stratigraphy of the site, and we know what's below and what's above. So the stables, the buildings, let's call them for the time being the buildings, these structures, the pillared buildings of Megiddo. And again, there are 17 of them, and the big courtyards, in front of them. So they are sandwiched between the Assyrian city on top and the 9th century city that we spoke about it before, below them. And they are tied to the fortification which encircles the Megiddo. And also according to the pottery found not in them, because they had already been cleared by the University of Chicago, structures which are related to them, to this layer, there's no question that we are in the 8th century. We need to say to the viewers that in the 8th century we are in a problem that we cannot use radiocarbon because of problems of the calibration. Let's put it this way. Perhaps we can in the very beginning of the 8th century, but not later. So radiocarbon doesn't play a role. But however, we know very well where we are, and we also see at the end of this phase, of this layer at Megiddo, of this stratum at Megiddo, the stratum of the stables, we see evidence of destruction, and this is for sure destruction inflicted on Megiddo, partial destruction, inflicted on Megiddo by Tiglath-Pileser III, the great king of Assyria, in 732 BC.
Let's talk about the function. I know that there's been a lot of dispute about this. Stables, of course, originally proposed, and then lots of ideas, textile dyeing, opium processing, all sorts of things. Barracks, right.
Storehouses, yes.
I think it's worth saying that this type of building has been excavated all over the southern Levant, and every time it's been excavated, as far as I can see, it seems to have had a different function. Without the troughs here at Beersheba, there were storehouses. At Mudanya, there were textile processing. This is a generic style of building. How do we know what it's used for here?
So first of all, I must give you a reflection on my early days in archaeology.
Okay.
I still remember, there was this dispute between Yadin, Yigael Yadin, the Israeli archaeologist. He was in favor of the stables, and speaking about the Megiddo stables in line with the University of Chicago. And Yochanan Haroni, my teacher at Tel Aviv University, excavated Beersheba. You mentioned it, and at Beersheba there's no question that at least in the last phase they served as storage places, storehouses, because they were full of vessels, pottery vessels. There is a saying in Hebrew that it has two meanings, and he said something with a smile. I still remember, even on television, these were the early days of television in Israel. mocking the whole thing that they are not stables anymore. That's it. But this is not so simple when we look at Megiddo. First of all, the Beersheba structures they look the same, but there are only a few of them. There is no place in the entire Levant. There is no place, as far as I know, in the entire region, even beyond the borders of the state of Israel and the neighboring countries, with a city devoted to these buildings. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are sitting here at Megiddo, a big city with the palaces of the layer before, and all of a sudden there's this change, and the whole thing becomes, the pillared buildings. And it was a little bit difficult for many to digest the idea that, one of the best real estates in the land of Israel is given to horses. So it's you need to understand what's going on here. Right. In any event, there were all sorts of ideas, and when we started here, we decided to attack, first of all, this issue by introducing methods from the exact sciences or life sciences. And there is a way perhaps to do it, learning from other places in the region where there were attempts to identify remains of horses, in the sediments, of course. Right. And but here at Megiddo it didn't work because there were no controls. In science you always need controls, and here everything was contaminated with animals, with evidence for animals. So it didn't work. We did our best, it didn't work, and then we were kind of desperate, I would say, semi-desperate. And we decided to take a completely different direction. And we brought here scholars from the United States who were at the same time also raising horses, especially Deborah Cantrell, who worked here with us for several years, and then later she wrote a book, The Horsemen of Israel, and I strongly recommend it. And Deborah was really an expert. She studied Bible at that time at Vanderbilt in the States, and she had stalls in Tennessee, so she raised horses, and she knew horses very intimately, the raising, the breeding, the training, everything. And we, here we were sitting here in this place with a big tent and having conferences in the mornings like now, discussing the question, and we were raising questions. For instance, how is it that there are no... She came immediately in the beginning and she said, these are stables, forget it. You only come to my stalls in Tennessee and I will show it to you. And I did go later. So we said to Deborah Cantrell, how is it, for instance, that there are no horse bones? How is it that we don't find horse teeth? How did they clean the facility? How did they shade it? How could they put, horses here standing in line and take one horse and go all over behind, with all the horses standing quietly and not kicking, the horse passing behind them. So I'm not going to go into details. She was able really quietly to answer all the questions from her very strong experience, and detailed experience in her stalls in Tennessee, in the United States. And she convinced us, of course, not to mention that there are other pieces of evidence, extra-biblical, also from archaeology. Bastam, far away in the north eastern sector of the ancient Near East, where a building like this indeed produced evidence for horses in the sediments. So basically, we closed this issue very well. The fact that we are dealing with horses.
Okay, let's say we're convinced about the horses, as you say. It's still, this is one of the most important cities before and after. Why devote so much of it to horses?
I think that the answer should come from the economy. So it's first of all, it's all about the economy, right? We remember one campaign of elections in the United States.
Economy, stupid.
Exactly, it's all about the economy. So here also it's all about the economy. Today we think about horses, okay, what do we care about horses? I'm telling you now, summarizing now for you what we wrote, Deborah and me, in one big chapter in one of the Megiddo reports, looking at the evidence of the entire region, ancient Near East at that time. We are speaking in the 9th and 8th centuries BC about the big period of the most important period of chariotry, of chariot warfare.
Okay.
And here's the trick. There are horses. I'm not a horse person. I'm now citing what I was taught by Deborah and others. There are horses in the south, in Nubia, in Egypt, and there are horses in the north, in the steppe regions in the far north.
Right.
And they are not the same. The northern horses are smaller, the southern horses are bigger. And for the chariots, you need the southern horses. Because if you put to the battlefield two chariots, one with northern horses and the other one with southern horses, it's not a match. So we are speaking about a period when Assyria did not control directly, neither here nor farther to the south in Egypt. So they needed somebody to provide them with the horses.
Okay.
And Israel took advantage of this situation, very specific geopolitical situation in the first half of the 8th century, to become the go-between, which means to import big horses from Egypt, and they bred them here and they trained them here, and they then sold them. So we know there are vague pieces of evidence, but still evidence for this. For instance, let me give you one example. We have evidence from an inscription of Sargon II. This is the king who takes Samaria. So he is in around 720 BC, and later, and he speaks about incorporation of a unit, of a chariot unit of the army of Israel, if you wish, with its commander into the Assyrian military, into the Assyrian army. And there is even perhaps a more tricky piece of evidence, and I'm going back now to Solomon and the horses in the Book of Kings, because one can ask whether all this is not retrospected or telescoped back by the author. I believe that all this description of Solomon in Kings, in 1 Kings between chapter 3 and chapter 10, reflects realities of Israel in the 8th century and Judah in the beginning of the 7th century. And the author assembled the memories and the information and portrays this great Solomon in order to promote his ideology of competing with the memory of the great northern kingdom, which is no more at the time, and to also compete with within Judah, the big debate, of where to go. He comes from the Deuteronomistic camp, and he is opposing to others and so on. In any event, all this information, I think this Solomon as a raising horses, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer built by Solomon, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, the expeditions to Etzion Geber and Arabia and the south and so on. All this, in my opinion, comes from realities of the 8th century and then again in the beginning of the 7th century. So these realities, what the author of the Book of Kings has in mind, the memory of Megiddo, the great horse industry city. The horse industry was one of the main economic ventures of the Northern Kingdom. If we think about the Northern Kingdom in the 8th century BC, we think about what? We think about oil, perhaps. We think about having this port at door. We may think about Arabian trade, according to some evidence in the south. And we can definitely speak about the horse industry, bringing from the south, training them here, and selling them to whoever pays more.
All right, so roughly 1/3 of the city is stables. What else do we have here?
So it's a horse industry, but we do have evidence for several other buildings and for the fact that a lot was invested here in the first half of the 8th century by these Israelite monarchs, especially probably Jeroboam II. First of all, we have the reconstruction of the gate. We have a new gate system at Megiddo, and the gate is huge when we speak about, of course, 4 chambers, not 6, but very broad, and also incorporated into a city wall. Matt, we are dealing with this on a daily basis. We have evidence for fortifications in the Middle Bronze, construction of fortifications, and then reuse of the old Middle Bronze fortification in the Late Bronze. But in the beginning of the Iron Age, there is no fortification. The city is not fortified. And then again, in the 8th century, all of a sudden, it is surrounded by this big wall, 3.5 meters wide, of stones and bricks on top. So this is another endeavor of these kings in the 8th century. We have one administrative building, a very interesting one in the eastern part of the mound, and it is interesting because yet again, like in the days of the Omrides, we see there a cult room, which means that the cult of the city is not in a major temple. I mean, they repeat the situation of the Omrides. They wish to control cults, so they put the cult, they enter the cult into their administrative building. So this is another feature that we see here at Megiddo. And finally, I should say that we have this very elaborate water system, beautiful water system, perhaps signaling that these kings were aware of the fact that things look very peaceful, but there is a reason to worry. Because, you know, this place has plenty of water, 2 springs on both sides of the tell, and people could go to the spring with their buckets and bring water. However, all this is fine as long as you are not under siege.
Right.
And when somebody puts siege on you, you don't have water, you're dead. So what they had this idea to have a fortification, and inside the fortification, cut a big shaft into the earlier layers of occupation, and then into the rock, the bedrock below us, and then cut a tunnel to the spring, tilt the tunnel a little bit inside so the water comes to the bottom of the shaft. They can pull water with buckets without the enemy, even if discovering this place, cannot climb into the city. And of course, they also camouflaged the cave with the spring. So this is one of the, there are several water systems like this in the country. The most well-known one is not in Israel, but you know, in Judah, the Hezekiah Tunnel, about the same time, perhaps a little bit later, a few decades later, and there is one at Hatzor. Some people say that the idea started before, even perhaps in the second millennium BC. I believe that here at Megiddo, it's an 8th century endeavor to cut this beautiful water system. So this is another structure, another item that we should speak about when we deal with 8th century Megiddo.
Right, so it's a pretty impressive city all around.
Yeah.
I suppose all of this is kind of ironic when we look at the end of this stratum, which sees the destruction of the city by the Assyrians, who were the former customers of the Israelites.
Yeah, and this happened, I think, because of a change of policy in Assyria. Assyria, you know, became an empire, and a strong, very strong empire, a player in the Levant in the late 10th century. And it was very strong already in the 9th century. If you remember, we spoke about the Battle of Karkar, Shalmaneser III. But then they influenced this region, but they did not conquer lands in the west. And in fact, there was a tango here between the two dominant local powers, mini powers, Israel and Damascus, and the big power, you know, in the background, Assyria. So for instance, let me give you an example. You know, Damascus dominated Israel in the second half of the 9th century BC. And the fact that Israel managed to recover was an outcome of pressure put by one of the Assyrian monarchs on Damascus in the days of Adad-nirari III. So there was this tango between the three of them. In any event, at a certain point, Assyria changed policy and decided really to conquer the lands and establish provinces and directly rule and even approach Egypt, you know, for different reasons. And the northern kingdom fell victim to this change of policy of Assyria, and in 732, the Galilee, the entire Galilee, and specifically here, Megiddo was taken over by Tiglath-Pileser III.
So the next thing that we can look at is the city that Tiglath-Pileser III, or his successor, built here at Megiddo, which really represents the next major phase of occupation here.
This is what we are going to do next time.